because when you live with smokers, you also get their genes if you're a child. But nevertheless, there are some genetic predispositions. Very rare germline mutations in the epidermal growth factor receptor gene, the T790M mutation, and I'll be talking about this a little bit because this is an important target for cancer treatment. There are various nicotinic acetylcholine receptor subunits that are associated with increased lung cancer risk. And interestingly enough, one of these is also a susceptibility locus for COPD, helping to put this together why COPD is a risk factor, one of the reasons why COPD may be a risk factor for lung cancer. This is by no means an all-inclusive overview. I'm just giving you sort of the highlights. So non-small cell lung cancer is a basket term. It really includes several different histologies, the most important one being adenocarcinoma. And it's got specific patterns of how it looks under the microscope. These tend to be peripheral nodules that obviously spread. And this is the most common type of non-small cell lung cancer. And it includes the non-smoking associated lung cancer, but most adenocarcinomas are still due to tobacco exposure. About 20% are squamous cells. These tend to be more central tumors, different appearance under the microscope, and more heavily associated with tobacco exposure. Somewhat less common are the large cells, which also tend to be more peripheral and not as clearly associated with tobacco, and then a smattering of other rare types of histologies. But we tend, at least in the past, we tended to lump everything together. It is not small cell that you learned about a few weeks ago. And here's, of course, small cell. You learned about that. So the development of lung cancer is a process, and it's a process that therefore allows us many opportunities for intervention, although the bulk of what we do in medical oncology is right here. Early to late cancer, once we find it, we cut it out, we radiate it, we give various systemic treatments. I will be talking about the much longer phase from the time of initiation where the exposures to tobacco, for instance, come in and damage the respiratory and alveolar epithelium through the gradual changes, dysplastic changes, until you have the development of the locally invasive and ultimately metastatic cancer. So the treatment strategies for lung cancer are very similar to other types of cancers. They're very anatomically based. Early stage surgery, you take it out. If you have more local involvement, including some lymph nodes, either if you can still resect, then you generally follow up with adjuvant chemotherapy, and that has been actually shown to improve survival. So that's standard for stage 2 and stage 3A. Once you get past just the very localized tumors and you start to have lymph nodes in the mediastinum, then you're generally talking about combined modality therapy. So that's usually chemoradiation, or sometimes you even add surgery to that. But once you get to the more extended involvement, either what used to be called 3V wet, in other words, pleural effusion, which is really systemic spread, or any kind of distant metastatic disease, then you're talking about systemic therapy. You can use radiation as needed for local control. Sometimes you will, if you only have one isolated metastasis, for instance, in the brain, the privileged site, you may cut it out. But for the most part, you don't have systemic treatment. Of course, that's the world that I live in as a medical oncologist. And small cell lung cancer, you've heard of it. So what's changed is that we now understand a lot more about the genesis of various types of lung cancers, and we now pay attention to the histology as well. So it turns out that there are a number of different driver mutations that are present in adenocarcinomas, and in fact, we can ascribe various drivers to about two-thirds of all adenocarcinomas. And for some of them, not that one, for some of them, they actually serve as a basis for targeted therapy treatment. And so this really started out with the epidermal growth factor receptor, which is a very important component in cell signaling. And turns out that about 10 to 15% of adenocarcinomas have EGFR mutations. And if you have an EGFR mutation, then there are various drugs, lorlatinib, afatinib, gefitinib, a series of drugs that will give you these are oral tyrosine kinase inhibitors, and they interfere with EGFR signaling, and they are associated with very substantial and prolonged response rates. So in contrast to chemo, which about 20 to 30% of people will respond to, and usually for about 5 or 6 months, if you have an EGFR mutation, the response rate is 3 times as large, and PFS, progression-free survival, is double. Okay, and median survival is also about double. This is a minority of people. Okay, but this is a very important treatment, and this is standard of care. If you have somebody with advanced non-small cell lung cancer, you will check, especially adenocarcinoma, you will check for EGFR mutations. We now know a lot more about the mechanisms of resistance. We have second-line drugs. Osimertinib is one that deals with a very specific mutation that in the EGFR receptor, which occurs in about 50% of people who progress after these first-line drugs, the T790M mutation. And again, we can get extended progression-free survival, although ultimately everybody does progress and die. And interestingly enough, the T790M mutation is the one that I mentioned earlier, which is a familial form of non-small cell lung cancer. There are other molecular abnormalities which are very important and which we check for when somebody has stage 4 disease. The EML4 ALK fusion gene occurs in about 5% of non-small cell lung cancers, again, mainly adenocarcinomas. And just like EGFR, mainly in never smoker. Okay? And there are now 4 drugs that are actually approved for treatment, very similar to the EGFR story, about 50% to 60% response rate, and about 8 to 14 months duration of response. So if you are unlucky enough to have lung cancer, but lucky enough to have one of these molecular abnormalities, your prognosis is much better, and there's more options. And of course, after progressing on these various oral tyrosine kinase inhibitors, chemotherapy still remains an option. ROS1 is another abnormality, similar story, perhaps better duration of response, using crizotinib, which is the same drug that we use for ALK translocations. BRAF, FDA recently approved, this is much less common, about 2% have the V600E mutations in BRAF, 2% of non-small cells. This is the same mutation you find in melanoma, and this is the same regimen that gives very similar results in melanoma and in non-small cells. RET, MET4 exon skipping. The reason I'm really putting this on is to show you that these are now all important because they serve as a basis for treatment, but rare mutations. And so you can imagine the complexity, because how do you know that somebody has a mutation? You have to have tissue. And so now we get tissue on everybody, and we send it for molecular analysis, and expensive and difficult, and some people you can't get enough tissue, so you can understand that the science of how we